Hey, what's up? Welcome back to your channel name. This time, we're going to dive into a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely. Charlotte Mills had just returned from an extended sabbatical from her job as an art teacher in Birmingham. Her husband, Thomas Mills, unexpectedly inherited a countryside estate after the sudden death of his grandmother, Eleanor Ashford, 3 weeks earlier. The house was tucked away on the edge of a forgotten village called North Hatherley, in the southern part of Devon, England. It was a place so obscure, even the most up-to-date GPS system struggled to find it. They decided to move temporarily, planning to clean the property and prepare it for sale. Thomas barely remembered the house. He had visited only a few times in childhood and retained almost no clear memories. But the moment they arrived, something shifted for Charlotte. The air was heavy, not in a suffocating way, but like an invisible weight rested on the land itself. The house was still standing strong, an imposing Victorian build with red brick walls and tall, arched windows. Yet the chipped paint, creeping ivy, and overgrown weeds betrayed its age. Inside, the scent of mothballs lingered, laced with dried lavender that had long since lost its charm. It was the kind of smell that clung to the back of your throat. Eleanor had been known as a recluse, a woman the villagers rarely saw. No one was close to her, not family, not neighbors. The house had remained untouched since her passing, like a stage frozen mid-scene. Now, Charlotte and Thomas were the new actors in a play neither of them had rehearsed for, standing in a place with a past they didn't understand. The property stood alone at the end of a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for one car. To reach it, they had to pass through winding paths lined with pine and hawthorn trees, their branches forming a skeletal canopy. The house was isolated, cut off from the nearest neighbor by several acres of rough, unkempt land. When the fog rolled in, which it did, often and without warning, the house seemed suspended in a dreamlike white abyss. The horizon disappeared. Trees turned into shadowy figures. Time seemed to slow, as if the entire area existed in a different rhythm from the rest of the world. From the upstairs bedroom window, Charlotte could see a lone, twisted tree in the middle of the rear field. It stood hunched and gnarled, almost human in its crooked silhouette. She couldn't explain why she stared at it for so long, or why she felt its presence more strongly than any other object in sight. The silence around it was unnatural, like sound itself refused to go near. What unnerved her most wasn't the isolation, but the lack of natural life. There were no birds overhead, no rustling in the hedges, not even the chirp of insects. Just silence. And in that silence, something watched. Something that didn't want to be seen, but was always there. The front door creaked open on stiff hinges. Beyond it lay a living room shrouded in shadow. The air inside was stale with a mix of aged wood, lavender, and something else, something that smelled like time itself. It looked as if Eleanor had simply stood up and vanished. The furniture was perfectly arranged. A floral rug, faded and fraying at the edges, lay beneath a coffee table topped with an old teacup gathering dust. The fireplace was filled with gray ash, long settled but undisturbed. A grandfather clock ticked softly from the corner, its sound too slow to be comforting. Family photos lined the mantel and walls. Most were black and white, too old and faded to make out faces clearly. One portrait stood out, Eleanor as a young woman, dressed in black, staring blankly into the camera while standing in the very field Charlotte had seen from upstairs. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes seemed too knowing for someone so still. There was no sign the place had been cleaned since Eleanor's death. Yet oddly, there was no thick layer of dust, no visible cobwebs. Charlotte found that strange. Who had maintained this house? Why did it look lived in? She couldn't shake the feeling that they had entered someone else's space. Not someone dead, but someone who had simply stepped out and might return at any moment. The next morning, an old man appeared near the front gate. Lean, weathered, and wrapped in a thick wool coat, he stood silently, watching the house as if expecting something to emerge from it. His name was Edgar, a lifelong resident of the village and the only neighbor within walking distance. He didn't stay long, nor did he say much. But when Thomas mentioned their plans to clean and explore the upstairs rooms, Edgar grew visibly tense. His eyes locked onto the small window on the top floor, and his head shook slowly, once, twice, before he turned away. He offered no explanation. Just a subtle warning, one that needed no words. Whatever was up there, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. After he left, Charlotte found herself unable to stop thinking about that window. She hadn't gone upstairs yet. The stairwell leading to it was narrow and steep, cloaked in shadow even during the day. The door at the end of the hallway was always shut. They hadn't locked it, but it never seemed open, ever. That night, they lit a fire in the old hearth, hoping to warm the icy interior. Flames licked at the logs, casting a flickering orange glow across the room. Thomas poured wine. Charlotte wrapped herself in 2 blankets, but the chill never lifted. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural. The fire gave off heat, yet her breath still misted in the air. The walls themselves felt like ice. Every corner of the house seemed to resist warmth, as though something deeper within rejected their presence. Charlotte's hands were numb. Her spine shivered no matter how she sat. Even the dog they brought along, a terrier named Kip, refused to leave the corner of the room, staring at the ceiling above as if listening to something unseen. That night, Charlotte dreamed of standing in the middle of the house, thick fog swirling around her ankles. From above, somewhere near the attic, she heard soft, shuffling footsteps. And then, a woman's faint humming, a lullaby that made no sense, but felt hauntingly familiar. Charlotte awoke to a sharp creak that sliced through the silence like a rusty blade. It wasn't a noise from the room or the hallway, it came from above. At first, she thought it was a dream, that the sound was part of some lingering nightmare. But then she heard it again, a drawn-out wooden groan, slow and deliberate. It echoed faintly through the beams above the ceiling. She sat up in bed, her eyes darting to the plastered ceiling. The attic door, which had been shut when they toured the upstairs earlier that day, now hung slightly ajar. No wind had blown through the still air. No draft could have caused it. The latch was old, made of wrought iron, and needed a hard push to open. Yet it now gaped open like a mouth mid-whisper. Charlotte didn't wake Thomas. Instead, she lay there motionless, straining her ears. She heard nothing else, no footsteps, no creaks, no whispers, but the silence now felt different. It was watchful. Heavy. Something had shifted in the bones of the house. The darkness above wasn't just empty space, it had become something sentient. Later that morning, they found the attic door firmly shut again. Neither of them mentioned it. Thomas seemed unaware, and Charlotte didn't dare bring it up. Not yet. The next day, she mustered the courage to enter the attic while Thomas was in town. Dust rose in soft clouds as she climbed the narrow stairs, the air dry and brittle. The attic was dimly lit by a single round window, its glass clouded by time. Beneath it sat a large, dark wooden chest. The chest was old, older than the house perhaps. It was carved with unfamiliar symbols, floral patterns, twisted branches, and something that resembled a star turned sideways. Its hinges were blackened with age, its lock thick and rusted shut. There was no keyhole, only a metal clasp tightly sealed. Charlotte reached out but hesitated to touch it. The wood pulsed with cold, as if the air around it was denser than the rest of the room. Around the chest were scattered relics, torn curtains, a child's cracked porcelain doll, and a faded wedding veil stained yellow by the years. She noticed scratches on the floor leading away from the chest, short, jagged marks like something had once been dragged across in haste. The attic felt wrong, like a place outside time. She didn't open the chest. Not then. But even after she left, her mind remained trapped in that dust-choked room, circling the chest like a moth to a flame. A few days later, while preparing the guest room for visiting friends, Charlotte noticed something peculiar beneath the wallpaper. The floral design had begun to peel near the bottom corner, revealing markings etched into the wall beneath. They weren't words, at least not any language she knew. The lines curved and intersected, forming sigils that hummed with quiet menace. They had been drawn with some dark substance, perhaps ink or ash, and covered more than just one wall. As she pulled back more of the wallpaper, the symbols multiplied, twisting upward toward the ceiling like vines. The air around her turned icy, just like it had in the attic. Her heart thudded harder with every inch of exposed wall. She tried to convince herself that Eleanor had simply been eccentric, perhaps obsessed with old religions or folklore. Maybe it was harmless. But something deep in her gut refused to agree. That night, Charlotte dreamed of those same symbols, now glowing red-hot in her sleep. They pulsed like a heartbeat, synchronized with something ancient and angry. She woke with her fingers burning, and found faint, reddish smudges on her fingertips. She hadn't touched the walls again since. Kip had always been an obedient dog, cheerful and curious. But within a week of settling in, his behavior changed dramatically. Every evening, as soon as the sky darkened, Kip would retreat into the corner of the living room and refuse to move. No matter how much Thomas or Charlotte coaxed him, the dog would whimper at the edge of the hallway and lay flat, eyes wide, tail between his legs. He never barked. He never growled. But his entire body trembled like he was staring into a place where something waited. Something only he could see. On one particularly cold night, Kip began to howl, low and mournful, as if answering a call only he could hear. The sound echoed through the house, unsettling in its sorrow. After that, he avoided the stairs entirely. He stopped eating, barely slept, and always kept his gaze fixed on the landing between the first and second floors. They took him to the village vet, but he found nothing physically wrong. Just stress, he said. Possibly adjustment to the new environment. But Charlotte knew better. Animals sensed things people couldn't. And Kip was terrified of something no one else could name. It was on the 8th day that Charlotte, cleaning the fireplace in a distracted haze, discovered something unusual. One of the bricks near the back felt loose. When she pried it free, soot and debris spilled out, along with a leather-bound book coated in ash. It was Eleanor's journal. Its cover was warped and brittle, but inside, the pages had been protected. The handwriting was thin and cramped, the ink faded but legible. Most entries were mundane, recipes, gardening notes, small mentions of weather and aches. But as she flipped deeper, the tone darkened. Eleanor began referring to voices in the walls, to dreams that bled into her waking life. She wrote of the one who came before, and the echo in the attic. The name Charlotte appeared in one of the final entries, long before Eleanor could have known her. It was written simply, "She will return. She always does." Charlotte slammed the book shut, her hands trembling. It wasn't possible. The journal predated their move. It predated even her meeting with Thomas. But her name, clearly, undeniably, was there. The mirror had always hung in the hallway, an antique piece with an ornate silver frame and a slightly warped surface, the kind that made reflections feel subtly distorted. Charlotte had passed it countless times without much thought. But on the 11th day, something changed. She was walking down the hall after checking the guest room when she paused, catching a flicker of movement in the mirror. It was subtle, a shift in shadow, the illusion of something brushing past. At first, she assumed it was her own reflection delayed by the glass. But as she leaned closer, she saw something else. Standing behind her was a silhouette, faint but unmistakable, a hunched figure draped in what looked like heavy black fabric. The shape was unmoving, yet the air around it seemed to ripple. Charlotte turned sharply, heart pounding, but the hallway behind her was empty. When she faced the mirror again, the figure was gone. But the surface now held a faint smudge where the shape had been, as if the glass had briefly burned with its presence. She wiped it clean, but the mark returned the next day, same spot, same vague outline. From then on, Charlotte avoided looking at the mirror unless she had to. But no matter where she stood, no matter the time of day, the mirror always seemed to catch something behind her, something that wasn't there. Thomas, once warm and engaged, slowly began to change. It started with little things, forgetting conversations, misplacing objects, sleeping in later than usual. Then he began losing track of time entirely. He'd vanish for hours, only to reappear confused, unsure where he had been. He claimed to be working in the shed or walking through the woods, but Charlotte often found him staring blankly from the upstairs window, unmoving for long stretches of time. When asked what he'd been thinking about, he'd simply shake his head, as if waking from a deep, dreamless sleep. His eyes began to look hollow, rimmed with dark circles. He stopped shaving, stopped reading, stopped laughing. Something was draining the life out of him. Sometimes he spoke in half-finished sentences, words trailing off like he'd forgotten what he was about to say, or like he was listening to something only he could hear. One night, Charlotte caught him standing at the attic stairs, staring upward with his hand on the railing, as if preparing to go up. But he didn't move. He stood frozen, lips parted, until she called his name from the bottom step. Only then did he blink, slowly turning to her with no recognition in his eyes. They hadn't used the old radio in the kitchen since they moved in. It was an analog relic from the 1950s, too old to receive modern frequencies. But on a rainy afternoon, while Charlotte was sorting through old linen drawers, it crackled to life. The sound was soft at first, static interspersed with distant notes. Then, slowly, a woman's voice emerged, low and haunting, humming a lullaby Charlotte didn't recognize. The melody was sweet at first, almost comforting. But as it played, it seemed to slow down, growing slightly dissonant, like it had been warped by time or intent. The lyrics, though faint, became clearer over time. They were in English, but the words didn't make sense, as if cobbled together from old sayings and forgotten nursery rhymes. Charlotte stood frozen by the doorway, her skin prickling as the song went on far too long for a normal broadcast. There was no station name, no announcement, just the voice, repeating the same eerie verse again and again. She reached to turn the radio off, but as her fingers touched the knob, the voice abruptly stopped. Not a slow fade or a burst of static, just silence, instant and absolute. She never heard it again, but the lullaby stayed in her head. Even in sleep, it echoed in her dreams. One morning, Charlotte awoke to the sound of wind hammering the windows. Rain lashed the glass, and the house groaned under the weight of the storm. She turned to Thomas's side of the bed, empty again. He'd taken to disappearing during the night now. She sat up slowly, something in the air feeling wrong. The room was colder than it should have been. She reached for the blanket when she saw the wall opposite the bed. There were scratch marks. Deep, uneven gouges ran from floor to ceiling, 5 in total, as if made by enormous claws. The wallpaper had been torn through, the plaster beneath chipped away. At the base, near the floor, the marks converged into a strange symbol, a crude spiral encased in a triangle. The bed had been pushed slightly away from the wall, though she didn't remember moving it. Charlotte's heart raced. She examined the scratches closely, expecting to find evidence of animals or human tampering, but the lines were jagged and rough, dug into the wall with unnatural force. Thomas didn't comment on them when he returned that morning, and when she mentioned them, he only blinked slowly, as if he couldn't see them at all. That evening, as dusk wrapped the house in pale shadows, Charlotte stood by the kitchen window, sipping tea. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fog that clung low to the earth. Everything was damp and silent, until movement caught her eye near the edge of the woods. At first, it looked like a branch swaying, but then she saw it more clearly. A figure. A woman. She stood motionless among the trees at the far end of the yard, wrapped in what looked like an old shawl. Her posture was crooked, shoulders hunched, face obscured by the low light. But Charlotte felt her gaze. Even from that distance, something pulled at her attention, like invisible wires connecting them. The woman didn't move. She didn't wave. She just stared. Charlotte blinked, and when she opened her eyes again, the woman was gone. She stepped out onto the porch, the fog swirling around her ankles. There were no footprints. No sound. Just that familiar heaviness, the same presence she'd felt in the attic, in the mirror, in her dreams. It was the first time she saw the old woman. But not the last. Thomas had always been a man of logic, engineering-minded, analytical, grounded in the physical world. But now, scraps of paper littered his desk and bedside table, each marked with the same cryptic imagery. At first, they seemed like aimless doodles, spirals, triangles, and shapes that looked vaguely archaic. But as the days passed, they began repeating with precise consistency. He never remembered drawing them. Charlotte would find him asleep on the couch with a pen still in hand, one of the symbols etched into the margin of a book, or scrawled on the back of a receipt. It wasn't until she opened the garage that the full extent of it hit her. The walls were covered. Black ink and charcoal marks filled the space, circles filled with concentric lines, symbols resembling runes, and beneath it all, a recurring emblem, an open eye encased in a jagged wreath. The patterns pulsed with something that felt almost alive. The air in the garage felt charged, as though the drawings had soaked up something not meant for this world. Thomas wouldn't acknowledge them. When asked, he'd stare at the walls, brow furrowed, then laugh nervously and walk away, as if the images weren't real, or he feared what they might unlock if spoken aloud. Driven by unease, Charlotte began searching the house more thoroughly. Every creaking step, every odd cold spot felt like a clue left behind. While sweeping beneath the dresser in the master bedroom, she noticed a floorboard that gave slightly under pressure. Curious, she pried it up, and found a thin envelope tucked carefully beneath. The paper was brittle with age, its surface stained by time and moisture. Inside was a single page written in dark, looping handwriting. It wasn't addressed to anyone. The letter was a warning. It spoke of a woman in the woods, of dreams turning into memories that didn't belong to the dreamer. It described a presence that fed on guilt, regret, and bloodline. The letter's author claimed the house itself was a vessel, not haunted, but cursed to awaken only when the right soul arrived. The final line chilled her, "Do not let her speak your name. If she does, you will never leave her again." Charlotte folded the letter with trembling hands and returned the floorboard to its place, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the house had wanted her to find it, like it was guiding her closer to something she might not want to know. One rainy afternoon, Charlotte pulled out an old photo album she had found tucked inside the sideboard drawer. It had been wrapped in linen, preserved neatly. At first, the photos inside were familiar, sepia-toned portraits of past owners, landscapes of the house across the seasons, a few dated images of a young couple standing near the front porch. But then came the pages she didn't remember. Photos of gatherings in the living room, with people she couldn't name. A woman standing at the window, her face blurry, but something about her posture was unmistakably familiar. The more she flipped, the more disoriented she became. One photo showed Thomas asleep in a chair, a date scribbled in the corner that hadn't passed yet. And then, there was a final image tucked in the back sleeve. A photo of Charlotte. She was standing in the backyard, facing the camera, though she had no memory of the moment. Behind her, in the photo's distant shadows, was the figure of an old woman in a shawl, her face a pale blur, her hand raised as if mid-gesture. The album's pages smelled of dust and dried lavender. Charlotte placed it back in the drawer and shut it tightly, but from that day on, she often caught the drawer partially open, the linen wrapping slightly undone. As night fell over the house, Charlotte began to dread the stillness. That stillness never lasted. Around midnight, just as the wind died down and the house settled, the footsteps would begin. At first, they were faint, like a raccoon or bird landing above. But over the following nights, they grew louder, heavier, deliberate. Not random animals scurrying, but pacing. Someone walking slowly across the roof, step by step, as if surveying the house from above. Thomas never heard them. He slept deeper now, sunk into a silence that no shaking or shouting could stir. But Charlotte heard everything. The footsteps would start above the bedroom, then shift toward the attic, as though circling something. Occasionally, she'd hear the faint creak of the attic ladder dropping, though when she checked, it was always up. One night, she left a voice recorder running in the hallway outside their room. When she played it back the next morning, her blood ran cold. The recording captured the footsteps clearly. But beneath them, another sound whispered between the creaks, a soft humming. A lullaby. It was morning. Charlotte stood at the bathroom sink, brushing her hair with hands that trembled more than they used to. The mirror before her had fogged from the shower, and she wiped it clean with a towel. What she saw in the reflection made her chest tighten. Her reflection was off. It wasn't obvious at first, just a slight lag in movement, like a poorly synced video call. But then it happened again. As Charlotte stood still, her arms resting at her sides, her reflection blinked. Not her. Just the image in the glass. She froze, eyes wide, waiting for another sign. Seconds passed, then the reflection smiled, a faint, unnatural twist of the lips, while her own mouth remained still. She stepped back, heart hammering, but the reflection didn't follow. It remained frozen, watching, as though someone else stood behind the glass. And in that moment, Charlotte realized something terrifying. Whatever was in the mirror was no longer her reflection. It was something else. Something waiting. Charlotte began to notice subtle things first. The way the mail carrier would drop off letters without stepping fully onto the porch. The paperboy stopped tossing the paper near the door, leaving it by the gate instead. And most of all, the neighbors, people she tried to greet in passing, never made eye contact. One afternoon, while watering a dying fern near the front steps, she watched a woman walking her dog on the opposite sidewalk. As the woman approached the house, the dog stopped suddenly, growling low. The woman tugged its leash, glancing nervously at the house. She crossed the street without hesitation, her head down, not once looking toward the windows. It wasn't just one person. Over the next few days, Charlotte saw it again and again, delivery workers skipping the driveway, neighbors circling around the block instead of cutting through the sidewalk in front of their home. Then, one early morning, she opened the mailbox and found no letters, only a piece of folded paper, stained and smudged with old dirt. It simply said, "She's still there. And she remembers everything." What began as silent wanderings through the hallway soon escalated into something far more sinister. Charlotte would wake in the middle of the night to find Thomas missing from bed. At first, she would find him standing in the kitchen, eyes open but unseeing, muttering under his breath with a dead expression on his face. But then came the bruises. He would wake up with scratches on his arms, his knuckles bloodied, sometimes barefoot and cold on the backyard patio with no memory of how he got there. One night, Charlotte discovered him in the basement, kneeling before a wall where more of the strange symbols had been drawn, this time not with ink, but with something darker, smeared like tar. His voice had changed during these spells. Deeper, almost feminine. A sound that made Charlotte's skin crawl. She tried filming it once with her phone, but the footage turned out distorted. Static filled the screen. And when the audio played, her name could be heard, repeated softly again and again, not from Thomas, but from somewhere behind the camera. Charlotte was tending the overgrown side garden when her trowel hit something hard beneath the soil. Curious, she dug deeper and uncovered a small, velvet-lined wooden box. Inside it lay a necklace, silver, antique, with a locket carved in the shape of a weeping woman. As she held it, a sharp jolt of nausea hit her. The temperature around her seemed to drop. Wind rustled through the nearby trees though the day had been still. She brought the necklace inside, but within hours, odd things began to happen. The locket would open on its own. She'd leave it on the dresser and find it resting on the floor. Its image of the weeping woman began to tarnish unnaturally, turning blacker each day. When Charlotte looked at the reflection of the locket in the mirror, she could see something else inside the locket, something that wasn't visible with the naked eye. The locket, she later learned, belonged to the grandmother who had died in the house decades ago. The same woman who was never buried properly. The same woman no one in the town ever wanted to speak about. 24. A strange stench began to permeate the house at night. At exactly 3:15 a.m. each night, the house began to emit an unbearable odor. It started faint, like the scent of damp earth, but quickly evolved into something far worse. The thick, cloying smell of rot, mold, and decay filled every room, no matter how many windows she opened. Charlotte tried everything: air purifiers, scented candles, deep cleaning every surface. But the stench always returned. It clung to the curtains, soaked into the bed sheets, embedded itself into the very walls. She followed it once, walking room to room, until she reached the attic door. The scent was strongest there. But when she opened it, the stench vanished completely, as though it had never existed. The worst part was how Thomas seemed unaffected. In fact, he seemed calmer when the smell appeared, almost as if comforted by it. Sometimes, he even smiled faintly in his sleep, murmuring phrases in a language Charlotte couldn't recognize. Driven by desperation, Charlotte decided to confront the attic once and for all. Armed with a flashlight, she climbed the ladder at night, when the house was thick with silence. Dust coated everything. Cobwebs stretched like lace across beams. But what caught her eye was a section of wall that looked too clean. It took effort, but after pulling back layers of insulation and boards, she discovered a sealed door, small, wooden, with no handle on the outside. It looked untouched by time. Her heart raced. She knew, without knowing how, that something was behind it. When she finally forced it open, the air that escaped was ice cold and stale. Inside was a tiny room, no bigger than a closet, with walls covered in writing, scrawled prayers, repeated names, and one phrase over and over: "She is watching." At the center of the room sat a child's rocking chair, motionless. But as she stared, the chair slowly began to rock. Back and forth. Back and forth. Without a sound. After Charlotte found the hidden attic room, something inside Thomas shifted completely. He started disappearing late at night again, but no longer in a trance-like state. Now, it was deliberate. Every time she awoke, she could hear the creak of the attic ladder being pulled down, his footsteps climbing slowly, methodically. He began spending hours in the room. When Charlotte confronted him, he claimed he didn't remember ever going there. But she saw the dust on his clothes, the deep scratches on his hands from the splintered wood of the attic door. There were even nights where he didn't come back to bed until sunrise. One night, Charlotte peeked into the attic after he returned. The rocking chair was still moving, faster than usual. A new item had appeared in the room, an old porcelain doll dressed in faded blue fabric. Neither of them owned anything like it. Its eyes were cracked and seemed to follow her. It had been placed directly in front of the per-covered wall, like an offering to something unseen. And Thomas? He began to smile in his sleep. It started one morning while brushing her teeth. Charlotte glanced at the mirror and noticed her reflection blinked just a second too late. She brushed it off as sleep deprivation. But over the next few days, it worsened. Sometimes, her reflection would tilt its head slowly, observing her as though curious. Other times, it would smile faintly when she wasn't smiling at all. It felt like something else was inside the glass, mimicking her only because it had to. One night, as she passed the hallway mirror in the dark, her reflection didn't move. It stood still while she walked. When she dared to step closer, it turned its head and faced her fully, before vanishing completely, leaving the mirror black and empty for a split second. The next morning, cracks had appeared across all the mirrors in the house. Tiny fractures, like veins, spreading slowly day by day. But only on her side. When Thomas looked, he claimed he saw nothing at all. While cleaning out the basement, Charlotte came across a box of old documents and photos. Most were damaged by time and mold, but one photo stood out, crisp and clean, despite its apparent age. It was a black-and-white image of a family standing in front of the house, decades ago. A man, woman, and 2 children. But standing behind them, slightly out of focus, was an elderly woman dressed in black with a veil over her face. Her posture was rigid, hands clasped, expression unreadable. Charlotte turned the photo over. On the back, written in delicate handwriting, were the words, "First day in the house, 1949. Grandmother insisted on being in the picture." Something about the phrasing felt off. Why insisted? And why was she standing so far behind? Charlotte stared at the woman's face. Despite the veil, she felt like she recognized her from somewhere. Then it struck her, the weeping figure etched on the necklace locket. They were identical. The grandmother was not just haunting them. She had never left. It began subtly, a faint rustle behind the headboard, as if a mouse had gotten inside. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate. Scratch, 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 in rhythmic patterns, always after midnight. Charlotte knocked on the walls, thinking it was pests. But the scratching would stop immediately, only to start again elsewhere. Soon it wasn't just behind the bed. It was behind every wall. Inside the closets. Beneath the floorboards. One night, unable to sleep, she followed the sound. It led her to a wall beside the bedroom dresser. Placing her ear to it, she heard whispering. Low, breathy syllables, repeating the same 3 words, "Let me out." She dug into the drywall with a hammer the next day and found nothing. No rats, no insects. Just more writing, etched into the wooden beams with a fingernail or knife. She feeds in silence. It happened during breakfast. Thomas poured her a cup of tea and casually called her Elena. She blinked, confused, thinking he was joking. But he didn't seem to notice. When she asked him who Elena was, he looked puzzled, claiming he hadn't said anything unusual. But over the following days, he began using the name more frequently. Not just in conversation, but in notes he left her. Elena, don't forget to lock the door. Elena, I'll be in the attic. Even his phone's contact list had been changed, her name replaced by Elena. Charlotte searched through the old documents again, and eventually found it, an obituary dated 1950. Elena Hawthorne. Died tragically in the very house they now lived in. Cause of death, fall from attic window under suspicious circumstances. Elena was the granddaughter of the veiled woman in the photo. The child who once lived in the room with the rocking chair. And now, it seemed, the house wanted her back. Charlotte began having vivid dreams, so real, they lingered in her senses long after waking. In one, she stood in a room she'd never seen before, wearing a nightgown from another era. The room was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and an old cradle in the corner. She heard a lullaby being hummed softly from behind her. The moment she turned, she woke up. But each night, the dreams continued. She wasn't herself in them, she was Elena. The perspective, the emotions, the thoughts weren't her own. She remembered climbing the narrow attic steps barefoot, hiding under the table during storms, and crying while an old woman brushed her hair and whispered lullabies in a language she didn't understand. Charlotte began losing track of reality. Sometimes, she would say something out loud and realize it wasn't her voice. She could smell lavender oil before falling asleep, though the house had none. She wasn't just dreaming the past, she was slipping into it. It began with a single sketch, a crumpled piece of yellowed paper folded tightly and placed under her pillow. It was a child's drawing, a little girl holding hands with an elderly woman. Both figures were drawn with X's over their eyes. Charlotte showed it to Thomas, but he dismissed it as a prank she was playing on herself. Still, the next night, another drawing appeared. This time, it showed the same figures standing in front of their house, the attic window circled in red. By the 4th night, the sketches had grown more disturbing. Stick figures of a girl in bed surrounded by dark, shadowy forms. Another showed a figure hanging from the attic beams. The details were too precise for a child, yet the style remained innocent, almost loving. The final drawing that week made her freeze. It was a sketch of Charlotte herself, lying in bed, her eyes crossed out, and a tall, veiled figure standing at her bedside. At the bottom, a shaky caption, "She watches when you sleep." It had always been subtle, gentle rocking in the dark, the creak of aged wood at midnight. But now, the chair didn't hide its movement. It rocked slowly in the daylight, in front of guests, with no explanation. Charlotte tried moving it to different corners of the attic, even placing heavy boxes on it to keep it still. But every time she returned, the chair was back in its place, facing the prayer wall, rocking gently. Once, Charlotte set up a camera to record the room while she went to work. When she reviewed the footage, she watched with horror as the chair began rocking violently without prompt. Then, around 3:17 p.m., the screen went black for 13 seconds. When the video resumed, the chair had stopped, and the camera lens had been smeared with something thick and red. There was no blood in the room when she checked, but the doll in the chair now had a tear across its porcelain face, revealing empty blackness beneath. She kept a journal to track everything, her dreams, the drawings, the sounds, the shifts in Thomas's behavior. But after a while, her entries no longer looked like her own. The letters were slanted, jagged, written with a heavy, shaking hand. At first, she thought it was stress. Until she found pages she had no memory of writing. One entry read, "She whispers when I sleep. She wants my skin." Another said, "Elena was weak. I am not. I'll never leave her." Some entries were written in a language she didn't recognize. When she took them to a local historian, he identified it as an old dialect of Flemish, a language once spoken by settlers in that region. A dialect that had died out decades ago. A dialect the grandmother in the photo might have known. Charlotte hadn't written these. But someone, or something, was using her hand. One morning, Charlotte woke to an empty bed. At first, she assumed Thomas had gone to run errands or clear his head. But as the hours stretched on, and the sun dipped below the trees, she realized something was wrong. His phone was still on the nightstand. His shoes were by the door. He had simply vanished. She searched the attic, the woods, even called the police. But there was no trace. On the second night, Charlotte stayed up waiting. Around 3 a.m., she heard the front door unlock slowly. Thomas walked in, barefoot, covered in dust, with a hollow look in his eyes. His skin was ice cold. When she rushed to him, he looked at her blankly and asked, "Did I fall asleep?" He had no memory of leaving. No recollection of the past 48 hours. And as he undressed, Charlotte saw something on his back, long, deep scratches, like someone had dragged nails down his spine. Beneath the scratches were faint words, barely visible under the skin. The same phrase that kept appearing in her dreams. "She feeds in silence." For months, the basement had remained locked. The key had been missing since before Charlotte and Thomas moved in. They never thought to investigate further, focusing instead on the attic and the hauntings above. But one morning, Charlotte found the door slightly ajar. Dust spilled out in soft plumes, and cold air drifted up the stairs. Charlotte hesitated before stepping down, flashlight in hand. The staircase creaked under her weight, and cobwebs clung to her arms like fingers pulling her back. At the base of the stairs, the basement opened into a stone-lined chamber. And in the center, a shallow pit had been dug, recently. At the bottom of the pit lay a rotting wooden box, partially open. Inside were old children's clothes, strands of gray hair, and a single porcelain doll. As she reached down, something whispered her name, not aloud, but inside her mind. Behind a loose stone in the basement wall, Charlotte found a tin box. Inside it was a fragile, leather-bound diary. The ink had faded, but the entries were legible. It was written by the grandmother, her name, Odette Verstraete. Odette had been a spiritualist during the early 1900s, believed to be a medium between worlds. After the death of her daughter, she became obsessed with binding spirits, claiming she could preserve them through ritual and sacrifice. She believed the soul could be transferred, kept alive through children. The diary mentioned Elena multiple times, referring to her as the vessel. Odette's final entries grew unhinged. She is almost perfect. The soul slips too soon. I must strengthen the bond. Blood must be fresh. The house must feed. Charlotte realized the truth, the hauntings weren't random. The house had been prepared, for generations, as a spiritual feeding ground. And Charlotte was next. That night, Charlotte tried to confront Thomas about the scratches, the drawings, the basement. But he just smiled at her, too long, too wide. His voice had changed. Softer. Almost feminine. He no longer blinked the same way. His eyes, once a deep brown, now had a faint blue ring circling the iris. Like someone else was looking through them. She asked him about the basement. He said nothing. But later, as she pretended to sleep, she heard him humming a lullaby, the same one from her dreams. Charlotte turned to face him in bed, but he had already gotten up. He was standing at the edge of the attic stairs, rocking the old chair with one hand, and whispering to the doll with the other. The doll's eyes slowly closed. The next morning, Charlotte tried to leave. She packed a bag, grabbed the keys, and approached the front door. But it wouldn't open. Not stuck, locked from the outside. She ran to the windows. Nailed shut. The back door was bricked over. Even the chimney had been covered. She was trapped. Every mirror in the house now showed different versions of herself, Charlotte with blackened eyes, Charlotte with gray hair, Charlotte screaming silently while the reflection behind her grinned. The rocking chair never stopped. Neither did the doll. And in the silence, the old gramophone in the basement started playing music that no longer existed, a vinyl Charlotte had never seen before, marked, for Elena. Forever. Desperate, Charlotte returned to the diary, flipping through the brittle pages one last time. At the very back, in shaky handwriting, was an entry dated far beyond the year Odette should have died. It read: "The child is here again. She returns with different flesh, different voice, but the same frightened heart. The vessel has come home. This time, I will not fail." Below it, written over and over again, was Charlotte's full name. Charlotte Blackwood. As she dropped the diary, the attic door slammed shut. A cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing every light. From the top floor, she heard the lullaby again, but this time, dozens of voices sang it in unison. The last thing she saw before the screen went black was her reflection in the window, only it wasn't her. It was Elena, smiling back. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.